Sam Olens.
Okay, so you're telling me I'm being filmed, so you're going to try and have me not walk the room? Is that what you're telling me?
Stand.
I'm not sure you succeed, but go for it. Okay, so it's a pleasure to be here. It is true I live right next door in Cobb, so today is a Cobb to Atlanta, to Paulding, to Atlanta, to West Cobb, to East Cobb kind of day. But it's a pleasure to be here. So I'm the state's lawyer, so that means I represent the executive branch, I represent the governor, I represent all the agencies, boards, authorities. So for instance, all the medical boards, all the licensing boards, Department of Corrections, state school boards, state school superintendent, all the colleges, universities, K-12, name it, we have it at that point. And we have 139 lawyers in-house. We have about 250 lawyers that help us outside. About 45% of the outside are children-related defects and child support, so that they can go to the local community, the local court, and handle all those children's issues. So I thought I would talk about a couple issues that we're spending some time on, and then I'm happy to take your Q&A because that's a lot more exciting, at least for me. So the legislation, every year we have legislation that we promote. This year was on pill mills. So for those of you wondering what a pill mill is, that's a pain clinic that doesn't do histories, physicals, that might not give out prescriptions because you can do it in cash in your office. And the drug of choice was Oxycontin or oxycodone. And I know that you had several in your county, and what you, I'm sort of reminded of, if you, then you might, a Southerner or whatever. But for instance, if you looked on 278 and you saw a tacky little sign that said pain clinic, walk-ins welcome. But when Brad had a bronchitis and he probably couldn't walk right in to get that prescription medicine, so you sit there and say, so why is it that if I have a chest cold, thanks to managed care, I've got to wait like 24 to 36 hours to make an appointment, but I can get a class 2 pain narcotic that can kill me called Oxycontin by walking right in the door. And what happened was 2 years ago, Florida passed significant legislation to stop it. At the time, 95 of the top 100 prescribing doctors for Oxycontin lived in one state, and it wasn't because they had a big car wreck. So they were going to Florida, getting the drug, taking it up 75, taking it up 85, transporting it. It's pure and simple, doctors involved in drug dealing. When they took care of the issue, folks came north. So we had a Wall Street Journal article last December 27 where they were asking me if we were going to do something about it, and I said, yes, we've got a bill that we want to get past House Bill 178 that will do what Florida did, and it will take care of the problem, and actually take care of the problem really quickly. Because once you let the medical board license and regulate these folks, they run to another state. And once you have the licensing ability to deal with them, and if they don't license, it's a felony, they run really, really fast. And that's what happened with House Bill 178. So it took effect July 1. So for instance, when I drive around the state now, I see a lot less of those tacky pain clinics walk-in welcome. I can't tell you what state they've moved to. That's really not my problem. But they're not in Georgia. In the December 27 article in the Wall Street Journal, there was a quote by a guy who moved from Florida to South Georgia because we didn't have the appropriate regulations, and he was a used car lot dealer. And I've always wanted to get my class 2 pain narcotics from used car lot dealers. So he can now go elsewhere for that problem, and hopefully he finds a good amount of time in jail for doing that. So we were happy to get that done. We spent a lot of time this year on the Port of Savannah. So about a year ago, the Corps of Engineers gave the Georgia Ports Authority what's called a record of decision to move from the 42-foot level to the 47-foot level, so that we can take the Panorex ships that will go through Panama Canal next year. So when you see that story in the newspaper, you think of Georgia Ports Authority working with the governor, sometimes Mayor Reed, working with the president to get funding. Who do you think's doing all the legal side of that? We all haven't thought about it. It's us. So we actually had 4 rounds of mediation in Charleston because we had 3 sets of litigation in South Carolina. We had environmentalists in South Carolina and Georgia, along with numerous elected officials the state of South Carolina that sought to delay construction for the harbor deepening specifically so it would give Charleston more time to catch up. Georgia started the environmental process in 1996. It takes a long time to deal with the environmental issues with water, let alone air. So we now have this lawsuit settled. Now we're only frankly waiting for the WARDA bill, which apparently may come up as soon as next week in the U.S. Congress. That will change the appropriate scope of the project for Savannah. We already have a bunch of the dollars. We need more dollars to come from D.C. as promised, and then that project should get built. About 350,000 jobs, direct and indirect, relate to that port. Number 2 economic engine in our state. Number 1 is Hartsfield-Jackson. So we spent a lot of time on that issue. We recently filed a lawsuit against the guy out of South Dakota because whenever Congress passes legislation to right or wrong, they generally go from one extreme to the other. I'm sure I'm not the only one who's figured that out. So when they passed Dodd-Frank, which I'm actually one of 11 states suing on, but when they passed Dodd-Frank, they made it really hard for people to get short-term small loans. So you have these folks that are not scrupulous, called payday lenders, generally go against young military folks in particular. You need a $3,000 loan, we'll give it to you overnight. Well, in Georgia, for loans of $3,000 and below, you need a license with the State Industrial Loan Commissioner, which is the state insurance commissioner. And the maximum interest rate is 10%. We had a company called Western Sky that was charging folks up to 340%. So we had folks, for instance, with a $2,600 loan that over 4 years you'd pay $14 grand. And what they were doing, which was rather cavalier, is they were telling these folks that they didn't tell them where the new bank account was so they could do the automatic withdrawals. They were either going to have them fired or go to the district attorney. Well, they could always try and have these folks fired, but they sure couldn't go to the district attorney because they weren't licensed and they were committing a crime in Georgia. So we have what's called a temporary restraining order where they can't do business in the state, and we're actually trying to nullify a bunch of those loans so those folks don't have those conditions which violate Georgia law. We get complaints weekly from folks that are ripped off by these payday lenders. Couple other issues that we're dealing with a lot. You may have read in the newspaper or seen on TV where after we won last year in the 11th Circuit with the tri-state water litigation involving Georgia, Florida, and Alabama, that the governor of Florida decided he was going to sue us in the U.S. Supreme Court over what's called equitable apportionment because he wants Georgia to get less of the water that emanates from our state and for Florida to have that to help the oyster fishermen. So that was filed about 2 weeks ago. We'll be making some public news probably in the next week to 10 days on who's going to assist the governor in being that litigation, potentially in the U.S. Supreme Court. But that's very different from the last 22 plus years of litigation because the prior litigation involving Georgia, Florida, and Alabama related to the operation of the core reservoirs, Lake Lanier, Lake Altoona, and the reservoirs downstream. This deals with any and all water that goes from our state to Florida. So it is not a metro Atlanta or a North Georgia, it's the whole state. So for instance, the Flint River and folks that are reliant on the Flint River, i.e. many farmers, have as much pressure on them with litigation as folks that are reliant on Lake Altoona or Lake Lanier. Finally, before I take some Q&A, we've been involved in another issue called sex trafficking. Now, I could call it human trafficking, but in Georgia, it's predominantly sex trafficking as compared to labor trafficking. So I call it what it is. Putting that in English, that's selling children for sex. And we find that the typical age is 12 to 14, not what the public thinks. And the typical child is not an illegal immigrant, not what the public thinks. And the typical purchaser is a white suburbanite. Now there are some boys that are sold, but it's predominantly girls. It's predominantly runaways, kids that leave their house, kids that leave foster care, kids that have a 22-year-old guy pay attention to them, and they're just enthralled that a 22-year-old guy's paying attention to them. So they go from their car to then being a prostitute that night. Now let me rephrase what I said. The girls aren't prostitutes, they're victims. But the trafficker selling them is if they are a prostitute. A 12 to 14-year-old girl is simply told, here's drugs, here's your dress, here's your shoes. You say anything that we don't like, you're dead, or your parents are dead. They are not willing participants. They are victims. And one of the big issues is, how do you take care of them? Because you show me a little girl or a little boy that for 6 months or so has been prostituted, you just can't bring them home the next day. There is one heck of a counseling rehab program. So we work with the governor's Children's Care Connection. We work with the GBI a lot. We work with police all over the state. The people who are selling, we don't call PIPs, we call them traffickers, and they need to have a much bigger fine, a much bigger prison sentence. So for instance, we've recently had, for the first time since we passed legislation 2 years ago, a guy got life in prison. The max used to be 20 years, now it's 25 to 50-year life. So in Fulton, we had a guy get life, in DeKalb, we had a guy get 40 years. The guy in DeKalb was sufficiently cavalier that he did a video trying to teach other folks how to do it. That takes guts. We call the girls victims, and we don't call the guys Johns. We call the guys purchasers. And part of the whole issue here is to tell those guys, mainly white suburbanites, if we catch you, your tail's going to spend a lot of time in jail too. It's not like buying a 20-year-old girl who's willingly selling her body for sex. So the purchasers need to spend a lot of time. And we have a couple cases working their way to trial in the system now, where we'll be able to say, see this guy, he was your neighbor, and he'll be spending a lot of time in jail, because he needs to, if you'd run the PSA for me.
It's more real than you know.
It's happening all around us, and Georgia is no exception.
The youngest, most trusting members of our state
are falling victim to sexual exploitation and trafficking.
It's time that criminals who purchase sex from children know that the secret is out.
And Georgia's not going to stand for it.
It just takes ordinary people being informed,
standing up,
and making a statement.
So when you tell me you didn't know,
we're not buying it.
Georgia's not buying it. For more information on how you can make a difference, go to ganotbuyingit.org.
We worked with Street Grace and with Youth Spark to put this together. We had all 3 U.S. attorneys from the state assisting us in the process. They're all indicting folks. For a crime you don't know exists, we're seeing an indictment or arrest in our state about every 10 days. Because it does exist, and it exists way too much. Paulding County, as an example, as of about a month ago, had about 180 cases so far this year. In contrast to, now what happens is you got to educate the prosecutors, you got to educate the investigators, because if they haven't had the appropriate training, they don't know what to look for. They don't know what they're dealing with. So a lot of it, from our perspective, has been educating the law enforcement community. We did some training last year, right before the Final Four. And right before the Final Four basketball tournament last year, we did a whole bunch of training for Central Atlanta Progress. We did APD. We did the taxi drivers. We did the hoteliers. We had the FBI task force with us, and had a whole bunch of arrests. I think saved 7 girls that weekend as a result of it. And the part that we're spending a lot of energy now, as you saw by the PSA, is the demand side. Because similar to drugs, you can arrest all you want, but you got to deal with the demand. Now, I can't deal with the demand by telling the guy, don't have sex. I can deal with the demand by saying, you have sex with a little girl, your tail's going to be in jail a long time. So that's what we're trying to do. And Ernie Johnson Jr. took the lead for us, and then the Falcons, Hawks, and Braves all gave me a star player to help me with the PSA, so we greatly appreciate it. You will notice the PSA doesn't have my name on it or my office's name on it. That's very intentional so that folks don't say it's political and don't run it on TV. It's all about running and dealing with the problem, not about the political side. So for instance, if you go to Hartsfield Jackson, they run this PSA all the time. Many of the transit systems in our state are now having posters that we've given them in this regard. So we're trying to push it on. Now I'm happy to take any Q&A. So ask me your tough questions, any legal questions you have in the state.
Just a quick question on
Yes.
the website you have there. Is that also where folks that are experiencing that issue can get help?
Who is it that you're wanting me to help?
Well, I mean, say a girl manages to get away from somebody long enough to
Okay,
get online.
they should just call the cops. Just call the cops. So, and then from there, the cops immediately call Georgia Care Connection, and Georgia Care Connection will give them that immediate care at that point. The website, it's both ga.notbuyingit.org and notbuyingit.org. It's sort of interesting. We've got a couple states now looking to model what we've done and to just get local sports folks. And we've told them, look, you can use our stuff while you want.
I actually met a girl. I was at a convention, and some friends of mine noticed this girl sitting over there. She was fairly young by herself. We asked her, could we help her in any way? And she was like, no. And so we went off to call and tell somebody. Of course, she disappeared right after that, after anybody noticed she was there. So,
And the problem is that the law enforcement folks haven't been trained.
they're afraid they're going to get arrested.
Right.
Instead of help.
Right. And so you need to be very gentle in how you deal with these girls, noting what they've gone through, or when it's a boy, noting what the boy's gone through. So we're really spending a lot of energy on training law enforcement. Fulton and DeKalb have really taken the lead around the state. I know Cobb was at the program I was at. We're trying to get more and more prosecutors and investigators to have the training. Because when you run into the girl, if you treat them as someone who should be locked in a jail cell, you're blowing it immediately from us getting at the problem and taking care of it. Other questions? Yes,
Will
sir.
the PSA, will it be just a mass list, billboards, television and all?
Well, it's subject to funding. So Street Race, for instance, is trying to raise a bunch of money. We have billboards that are now up like on 16, 20, that type of thing. They've got a couple in Atlanta. It's a function of Street Race is in charge of raising the money to pay for the billboards. Yes?
Is there a place to download it from the internet?
Oh, absolutely. You just go to my website, law.ga.gov. That's the state of Georgia Department of Law website. And with the search engine, just do Georgia Not Buying It, put sex trafficking, and you can download it. And there's no copyright issue. We want everyone to have access to the program. The website that was referenced, the same thing. Any materials you see on the website, go for it. There's no pride in ownership. Yes, sir.
Do you have any estimates on the number of children that are being brutalized in the state of Georgia currently?
No, not good ones, to be honest. And it's very tricky, too, because they're taken from state to state. So, for instance, one of the parts of House Bill 200 that we passed 2 years ago provided training for law enforcement, separate from prosecutor training. So there was a traffic stop in Greene County by a deputy sheriff from Tolliver County. Girl in the back seat, guy in the front seat. And when he looked at the girl, when he sort of asked a couple questions, it reminded him of the recent training he'd had with sex trafficking. And he decided he needed backup, so he called the GBI, which takes the lead for us statewide in this area. And GBI agent came to the scene, separated them, asked the questions, found out the girl who was 17 had been trafficked since she was 12. So just imagine 5 years of her life had gone. And Georgia was either the 4th or 5th state. So it is common to move the girls around. So how do you deal with double accounting, etc., is really difficult. The GBI is working on a report now which should be made public pretty soon to give more information in that regard. So Director Keenan and his folks are working on that. I sort of take the perspective that, I mentioned to you that Fulton, as of a couple weeks ago, had like 180 of these cases. And I mentioned to you that the stereotype you walk in with is inaccurate, i.e. the typical purchaser's white suburbanite, upper middle income gentleman. So we don't see a lot of this in inner city. We see it in the affluent areas. And we see it throughout the state. And we see it to include fact patterns you're not comfortable with even more. I.e. when the bill passed 2 years ago in the House and we were fighting to get it passed in the Senate, there was a case of a family that had a 14-year-old daughter that was having the used car lot manager have sex and take pictures of their daughter every month in lieu of the less than $300 a month minivan car payment. Mom got 8 years, Dad got 10, used car lot manager got 10. Old law. Would be 8 and 10 years now. So it includes people selling their children for money. So it's anything and everything, the worst in society at that point. I take questions other than sex trafficking too. we deal with other legal issues in the state of Georgia. The point I tried to make with the Port of Savannah is that when you see articles in the paper, you don't think about, so who's getting it done at that point? But it's the law. That's the lawyers for the state of Georgia that do all that stuff. Any other question? Well, it's my pleasure to be here and to talk about such positive, optimistic discussions at this point. So just remember the Port of Savannah.